Hi, good afternoon. This is the Master Your Dragon series, and where we are covering advanced skills in emotional competence. And I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller. And we're currently busy with Module 4, where we're looking at the emotional self. In Module A and Module B, we looked at both happy and unhappy emotions. And now we're going to put it all together, and we're going to talk about emotional regulation. How do you train that inner dragon of yours? So when I talk about emotional regulation, one can imagine there's sort of three levels of sort of more and more advanced skills in the world of emotional regulation. And at level 1, and that's what we've been doing a lot of, is being able to have emotional insight and being able to understand how your particular emotions are driving your particular behavior. So in the different models, we've had self-reflective exercises where you've explored a bit your distressing as well as your pleasant emotions. And you've also explored those behaviors that you might habitually fall into when you find yourself in some sort of stressful situation. So that's already a good start. Being able to understand how emotions and behaviors are linked is definitely necessary if you want to be able to start having some sort of control over that. The next thing, and this is already a tricky bit, is being able to recognize when one of these emotions arise. And the reason why it's tricky is because this is a biological reality that literally takes over when you are under threat. So your body has these subconscious mechanisms to deal with anything that makes it feel unsafe, or maybe that kicks in one of those drives. And these are subconscious biological impulses that literally just arises. And so you might find yourself in a rage and already behaving and reacting on that rage before you've even cognitively completely realized that you are angry. So the next level of skill is just being able to notice when you are in a specific emotion. And then sort of the third level is emotional competence. And this is your sort of ability to start modifying that behavior that this biological impulse is driving you towards. So if you're rage, you usually go into smash mode. You want to destroy that obstacle that's in your way. And being able to stop yourself from actually engaging with that emotion, that is a whole nother level of skill. And one mustn't underestimate how strong these impulses can sometimes be. So let's just major levels, but it's helpful every day to be aware of the fact that you are always in one of two modes. So either your survival brain is leading the party and your dragon is taking over, and that's usually when you're feeling under threat. And when you're in survival brain mode, you will have these very specific behaviors that becomes manifest to try and deal with that threat or make you feel like you're dealing with that threat. If your survival brain is nice and quiet and there is no threat around, then your master brain, your prefrontal cortex becomes available. And now you have these amazing qualities like being able to reflect, be aware of yourself, to be able to be empathic, and to have inhibitory control. So these are higher level functions that can help you manage this dragon. So what's helpful to realize about the two modes is that it's two biological states that you are in, and there's a switch. And the switch is adrenaline, as well as a whole range of other neuropeptides, quite complicated biochemistry. But you can imagine there's literally a switch that switches on that particular biological impulse. And that switch is quite often triggered by threat, which can either be on a physical level, and that can either be sort of feeling physically unsafe, or even be driven by one of those physical drives like hunger, for example, emotionally, when you're feeling emotionally unsafe in any way, and when your freedom of expression in some way gets threatened. So when we feel under threat, body makes adrenaline, and then we switch over into survival brain mode. And so within those two modes, there are these sort of reigning emotions that one can find. So in survival brain, you will find yourself either within panic, grief, or fear or rage, or those primal emotions, and then various interesting combinations and cognitive extension gives you your whole range of distressing emotions. Similarly, when the survival brain is nice and quiet, you now have the possibility to enter these emotional rooms we talked about, such as play and care and seek. So let's now look at the second level. So the first level is just knowing that. Making those links makes a huge difference. And then the next thing is being able to start training yourself to pick up emotions as they arise. And we call this dual awareness. And there's an amazing book called The Inner Camino, written by Sarah Holloway and her sister. And she coins this term dual awareness to describe this amazing prefrontal super skill that we have, where we can think about our thinking, and we can even think that we think about our thinking. But it also makes it possible for us to observe our own emotions, to observe our own behaviors. And we can do that afterwards. Something has happened. We can reflect back and think about, oh my gosh, look what I did. But it's also possible in the moment when something is happening that you observe yourself in that state. And this is a skill one can train. So this is something that one can learn. Any self-awareness program usually works with this. And I actually do have a little dual awareness exercise that we will do at the end of this particular module, that you can learn how to practice observing yourself. And we'll go into that into detail a bit more later. So the idea is as you train this particular dual awareness skill, when you're on scenarios when the conversation is not going well, you have those scenarios where, no, this does not feel happy, you're not feeling happy, or you can clearly see the other person is not feeling happy, situation is uncomfortable, something's just not nice. And that being able to ask yourself simply that question, hold on, am I just going into survival mode here? Or maybe is this other person actually in survival mode at this moment of time? We can't always do something about the emotion when we notice it. Remember, it's biological, but noticing it already can help you make a choice. And the big thing to remember is when you notice the emotion, to be able to remember, don't fight fire with fire. So you don't at this point want to react and respond into one of those behaviors when you are in survival mode. So that's the thing, is being able just to become aware of these subconscious emotions as they arise. So level 3 now is when we start developing emotional competence. And the thing with emotional competence, and this is particularly what you do in the moment when you find yourself in this very powerful emotion that's busy overwhelming you. And it's very important to realize that this is a physiological reality, right? It's driven by adrenaline. You can't reason yourself out of it, and you can't reason somebody else out of it. You've got to manage the adrenaline. So whatever you do before you start trying to engage in any sort of way with either yourself when you're very stressed or somebody else when they're very stressed, is first manage the adrenaline. And so we have to go back into a little bit of basic neurophysiology of how the body works. So when you feel under threat on any of those levels, and quite often when your drives are also triggered, your survival brain comes on board. It can be either neuroadrenaline or some of the other neuropeptides, depending on what's being triggered. And then especially when one's in a scenario where you're going into that fight, flight, fawn mode, the fight, flight mode changes your whole body to be able to face a threat. So literally your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, you start breathing faster, your blood flow changes, so you start getting those butterflies on your stomach, you start sweating, your hands start even shaking. So this whole physiological change happens. And what's quite interesting is as the body physiologically changing, if you are responding to those changes, so for example, if you're frightened, you might hide, or if you're enraged, you might actually be fighting somebody, or your shoulders might go up. Those changes let the body know that you are busy fighting. So the more stress you carry in your body, the more it helps to keep this cycle going. The second thing that happens is that because we're now in a paranoid state, we're in survival state, we become hyper-vigilant for any other possible threat, and you start developing all these cognitive ideas of things you need to look up from. And this is the origin of all those irrational thoughts we talked about earlier. So you start seeing every kind of danger there possibly is. All your biases will come into play at this point. And these irrational thoughts normally is scary, so they cause more threat. And Buddha likes to call this the second arrow. So the first threat is you get shot by an arrow. The second thing that happens is now you go into stress mode, and now you're going, oh no, why did he shoot me? And what's going to happen to me? And will I die? And probably quite sensible to be worried about stuff like this. But those worries, the thoughts you're having about being shot by the arrow, that creates the next set of stress, and that keeps that cycle going. So to interrupt the stress cycle, if you are in a situation where you are caught in any of these powerful emotions, is there's two basic physiological ways to try and switch off your adrenal glands. The first is managing this physiological feedback. So if you ever worked with a psychologist, if you're somebody who gets panic attacks, for example, they will teach you breathing exercises and relaxation exercises that physically relaxes the body. So the big thing is trying to actually relax the stress out of the shoulders, relax the stress around the stomach, relax the legs. And there's a lovely both apps, meditations, lots of beautiful books around how one can physically relax the body. When you're physically relaxing the body, it sends a message back through that cycle that, oh, actually, the threat is past, and the adrenal glands will stop producing adrenaline. The other way of doing it is actually responding and acting physically on this adrenaline, and that will be your classic exercise. So going for a run, going for a brisk walk, doing yoga, or any sort of form of exercise is also another way to actually help the body feel that you're managing and you're dealing with this threat, and that will also help to reduce that adrenaline, especially if it's not fight-flight kind of physiological posture. So that's the first thing, is manage your physiological feedback. And then the second thing is now managing these irrational thoughts. So the shortcut way of doing that is trying just to cut the thoughts off. And the powerful way of doing that is through mindfulness. Is probably the most popular tool on the market at the moment. Lots of beautiful books and apps on that. But you can use any kinds of meditation. You can use prayer. You can also use a scenario, for example, when you're talking through with somebody else. But mindfulness, the principles are very simple. You concentrate and focus very powerfully on a particular sensation in the present moment in time. That can even be something like your breath. That can be something like sound. It can be something that you're focusing or looking at. But within that moment, you try and empty your mind of thoughts and you just focus on the present time. And if you can combine that with relaxing the body, this will start to help to actually break this adrenaline cycle and help you just get to a point where your adrenaline goes down and then your higher brain will miraculously arise. So let's just look at what that looks like in action. So let's imagine you're in a scenario, you come home at night and your partner is very upset about something. They've had a really bad day and they've freaked out. And so you come home and they say something that's either rude or inappropriate, or they attack you in some way. Depending on all the dynamics in your relationship and of who you are and what kind of a day you've had, let's assume that one of these distressing emotions can come on. So you either become distressed and freaked out, and if you're feeling rejected, or you might feel fearful if you're feeling in danger, or you might go into rage about how unreasonable this all is. This happens very quickly, it happens very subconsciously, and it's going to give you an impulse to move, to do something. And this leads, of course, to all those counterproductive behaviors we were talking about. So you have this powerful need to respond to this trigger because that makes you feel like you're managing your emotion. And as we've said, none of these are going to be very particularly helpful in that scenario. So if you respond to your partner who's being rude by either preaching to them or criticizing them or gaslighting them, or maybe just leaving the room and not talking to them at all, or going off and having a shot of whiskey, none of that is going to solve that particular problem, and you quite often makes it worse. So if you now make your partner feel unsafe, they're going to go into one of their favorite methods, and the next thing you have those horrible, horrible late night fights. So what we want to train ourselves to do is just to become aware of when the emotion is there, just to notice, okay, hold on, I have just been triggered. I'm in survival mode. I'm right now in rage or panic or whatever it is. And the second thing that needs to come almost immediately on top of that is just to stop in terms of going into one of those behaviors. And the simple thing is no hands, no words. So just shut up. If you have to say something, you can scream if you want to, but you're not allowed to use any words, and you're not allowed to use your hands. You're not allowed to break anything or touch anything, and just create a little bit of a moment before you go into these automatic behaviors. Sometimes it's not possible to just get out of these emotions. So Emily Nagoski calls these emotional tunnels. And sometimes you just have to go through them. And if you can't at that moment address the emotion, then at least what you want to do is just not engage in one of those behaviors. So if you are wanting to be able to get out of that powerful emotion and you're up to taking that sort of next level, then you can actually look at how do I now break this physiological stress response through one of those two techniques that I've mentioned, through either relaxing the body or using a way to try and interrupt that irrational flow. And if things go well, say maybe you had not had such a bad day at work, you're able to see when you're looking at your partner, hold on, they're also obviously in survival mode, you've managed to not respond, and you're able to calm yourself down and manage to manifest your higher self again. So you get your survival brain under control, you've got your dragon sorted, your master kicks back in, and now you're actually able to bring a whole level of master skills to this interaction. So now you might be able to respond to your partner in such a way where you can not make the situation worse and potentially even help that scenario get to a better place. So there's lots of amazing skills that one has access to automatically when you're in master mode. But I want to talk about one specific superpower that we have when we are in master mode, and the one that you will use when you are encountering somebody else in dragon mode. And that superpower is compassion. It's like all the movies, right? They always end up with love as the punchline. Because compassion is what makes us feel safe. So in a scenario where somebody's feeling unsafe, and that's why these emotions have arisen, by making them feel safe or being compassionate with yourself and making yourself feel safe is an extraordinary, powerful way to restore safety. It doesn't always work. It depends, obviously, what's going on for the other person, but it definitely is not going to make things worse. And if you're in that mode, and say, for example, you've got a child who is freaking out and is losing it, maybe even somebody who's neurodivergent, who is struggling to have the skills to understand and work with their emotions in that moment in time, being able to be in your higher self, being able to accept that child's dragon, to be gracious, we all have dragons, and being able to recognize and affirm the emotion. You are angry, you are scared, you are sad, you are struggling. I can hear you, I can see it. So rather than responding to the behavior, you are responding and trying to bring safety to that emotion. Part of your higher self, then, a part of this compassion that you bring to the issue is then being able to use reflective listening to identify what's going on here. Why is this person not feeling safe? What has triggered this powerful emotion? And then there's amazing advanced communication skills, which we'll cover in a different module, things like appreciative inquiry and nonviolent communication, where you can now use your higher tools to actually create a conversation that might help that person reach their own higher self again. So basically, on summary, the craft of solving any problem, complex problems, for example, in relationships, is if you can turn towards those problems in a calm, that means higher self is present, and you bring those emotions of warmth, caring for somebody else, and curiosity. How are we going to figure this out? So this particular model comes from that book, Come Together, by Emily Nagoski, amazing book about relationships and sex. And she talks about this importance of how we create those spaces to solve the issues that we need to talk about. And what you don't want to do is sit down with your partner and try and solve your marriage or your relationship in rage or in fear or in panic. That's just a recipe for disaster. And a big part of going to, for example, a counselor is creating a space where we can bring our calm, warm, curious selves to that conversation. So dragons do not solve problems. Only yourself, your authentic self, can actually solve those issues that are really important in your life. So lastly, I just want to describe the dual awareness exercise. It's fairly simple, the concept. It's something you can then go and practice it yourself whenever you feel like you're having a moment. It's quite fun. And it's an exercise of observing yourself. I've called it here the double. That's another way of talking about our inner dragon. It's that part of us that looks just like us but behaves badly. And so you find a space where you can obviously sit comfortably and you're not going to be disturbed. You can close your eyes. You don't have to close your eyes, whatever you're comfortable. But you're going to imagine that a part of yourself separates and is going to observe yourself where you are sitting. I quite like to be a little bit higher than myself. So I imagine myself either levitating or sitting on a magic carpet. If you're quite an angels person, you can imagine yourself with wings, and you're sitting slightly higher, like that higher self of yourself, and you're looking at yourself. So imagine yourself, visualize yourself sitting there in that chair, and then imagine yourself in the context of your life. So firstly, who you are, where you work, who your friends are, sort of, and you can imagine almost in the larger community. This is the little village you live in. This is the city you are in. This is the country that you live in. This is and then you can also use a biographical view. So you can imagine yourself in terms of your life story. This is where I've been. This is where I've grown up. This is the age I am now. This is where I'm at in my life. This is where I think I'm going, your development and your life path. Now, the interesting thing about this is that you want to get to a point where you're observing yourself from that higher balcony view. And the way you know that you've got there is when you start looking at yourself and you feel have an experience of compassion. So that's quite interesting, because quite often we can observe ourselves and we find all the stuff that's wrong. Oh my goodness, why do you do that? And what have I said that again? And my life is such a mess. And why do I not sort things out? But the more you remove yourself from yourself, the further you step away from yourself and look back at yourself, the more you will have an experience of your fragility as a human being, and your vulnerability within the world and the life that we live in, and your humanity to be who you are, and the things that you've had to face and deal with, and the personality traits and ideas that you have that has both helped and hindered you. Whenever we see somebody in context for the whole thing for all that they are, we will always experience this experience of compassion. And this exercise is also taught by Sarah Holloway in their books, The Inner Camino. And I find it a beautiful ability to be able to view ourselves from that point of compassion. And you actually want to be able for it to be biologically real. You want to really feel that, oh, look at this person. If you're able to do that for yourself, then that's the kind of space you want to create when you are in a scenario where you've had a bad day or you want to reflect on something. If you want to reflect on yourself and your emotions and your behavior, that you try and reach that balcony view, that you try and reach that particular place. And then the real extraordinary advanced skill of this is if you become quite good at observing yourself with compassion like that, that you use that same skill to observe somebody else. If you listen, you see them. In that moment, if you are in that higher balcony view, you can view them in compassion for where they are and who they are and everything they're facing. And that is an extraordinarily powerful way to bring safety to somebody and help them reach their own higher self in that moment. So I hope that's helpful and that that's something that you can use going forward. And we will have some more in the next set of modules. We will be specifically looking at relationships.